Emily Carter vanished from her bedroom without a sound, and her husband Brian, once seen as the heartbroken spouse, soon became the center of a chilling conspiracy that no one saw coming. Emily Carter's disappearance began like the opening scene of a mystery novel. Quiet, normal, almost too perfect. It was a Friday morning, March 3, 2023. The sky over Ravenwood was still dark when Brian Carter dialed 911, his voice tight with confusion and rising fear. He told the dispatcher that his wife was gone, not just missing, not out for a walk, gone, vanished from their home during the night. Emily, 32 years old, was known for being steady, careful, almost predictably consistent. She worked from home as a graphic designer, rarely missed her morning coffee, and spent most evenings curled up with her golden retriever, Max, watching crime dramas or sketching in her journal. The neighborhood of Ravenwood was safe, almost boringly so. A place where people didn't lock their doors until the 10 o'clock news came on. A place where this kind of thing simply didn't happen. Brian said he had woken up around 6:40 a.m. The first thing he noticed was the dog whining at the bedroom door. The second was the silence. No sound of the shower running, no footsteps in the hallway, no light spilling in from the kitchen. He assumed Emily had already gone downstairs, maybe for a morning walk with Max. But when he made his way through the house, something felt off. The back door was cracked open, just enough to let in a breeze. Emily's phone was still on her nightstand, plugged in. Her purse was in the entryway, her car parked in the driveway. She hadn't taken anything. She hadn't left a note. She had simply vanished. By the time police arrived, the neighborhood had already started to buzz. Police tape-lined the Carter home as detectives moved through the rooms, making notes, taking pictures. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no overturned furniture. The back door's lock was intact, with no damage. Nothing was stolen. Nothing screamed of violence. But that was part of the problem. Everything looked too normal. Emily's closet was untouched. Her favorite jacket, the one she wore every day, still hung by the door. Her keys and ID sat in a small ceramic bowl near the entryway, exactly where she always left them. But her sneakers were missing, the ones she wore on walks with Max. That detail seemed almost meaningless at first, until police considered the timeline. There had been no reported sightings. No neighbors had seen Emily leave the house. No doorbell cameras on the block captured her walking past. It was like she had slipped through a crack in the world, quietly, without a trace. Investigators began their usual sweep, talking to friends, coworkers, family. They asked about mental health, recent arguments, financial issues, infidelity. Nothing stood out. Emily hadn't expressed fear or concern. There were no signs of depression or plans to disappear. She hadn't packed a bag. There was no search history on her laptop for travel or buses or fake identities. One neighbor mentioned hearing a strange noise around 3:00 a.m., a soft crash, like something falling. He assumed it was just an animal. Another mentioned seeing a light flicker on and off in the backyard. But these fragments didn't form a clear picture. Then a crime scene technician noticed something small, almost missed completely. Behind a line of potted plants near the back deck, a ceramic flower pot lay broken. The soil had been disturbed. It didn't seem important, until it was compared with the dog's behavior. Max had scratched at the back door repeatedly that morning. Dogs know when something's wrong. Still, there were no footprints, no tire marks, no sign that anyone had entered or exited with Emily in tow. The case moved from unusual to unsettling. Emily hadn't just left. It was as if she had been removed, taken, erased. And for the investigators, that was the most terrifying part. There was no story to follow, no thread to pull. Just silence, and the shadow of a question hanging over the Carter home. How does a woman disappear from her own home without leaving a single clue behind? The days following Emily Carter's disappearance were consumed by a fog of uncertainty. In the beginning, there was hope that she had walked away on her own, maybe to clear her head or escape something unspoken. But as the hours turned to days, and the days crawled into weeks, that hope thinned like smoke in the wind. Police worked around the clock. Volunteers combed through nearby woods and creeks, fanning out with flashlights and printed flyers. Search dogs sniffed through hiking trails and parks Emily was known to frequent, while drones scanned from above. But every search ended the same way, empty-handed. The landscape offered no clues. Not a single shoe print, not a thread of clothing. Nothing. Inside the Carter home, the investigation deepened. Forensics teams conducted a second, more invasive sweep of the property. Every drawer, every closet, every inch of the backyard was examined. They removed sections of carpeting and took soil samples. And then, in the laundry room, tucked behind the dryer, they found something: faint traces of blood, invisible to the naked eye but glowing under luminol. It wasn't a pool, just tiny droplets, scattered like a whisper. A lab confirmed the blood belonged to Emily. It could have been nothing. A nosebleed, a minor injury. But when someone vanishes, even the smallest stain feels heavy. Investigators didn't say it out loud, but the tone of the case quietly shifted. A missing person report started to feel more like a potential crime scene. Still, there was no evidence of a struggle, no broken furniture, no bruises on the walls. Whatever happened, if something had happened, it had been swift, silent, and calculated. That alone was chilling. Brian Carter remained the center of attention, though officially he was not named a suspect. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and by all accounts, no motive. He attended every press conference, wore the same tired expression in every televised interview, and repeated the same words: "I just want her home." But something about Brian gnawed at the edges of the public's mind. He seemed rehearsed, at times detached. Internet forums began dissecting his behavior. Some found it odd that he hadn't joined the search parties. Others noted he appeared too composed for a man whose wife had vanished. Rumors started to swirl. Behind the scenes, detectives looked into the Carters' marriage. There had been no filed reports of domestic trouble, no divorce filings, no restraining orders. But that didn't mean the marriage had been perfect. Friends described Brian and Emily as quiet together. Not cold, but not close either. One coworker mentioned that Brian had started showing up early to work and staying late in the weeks before Emily vanished. Another recalled overhearing a tense phone call, though no details could be remembered. It was all anecdotal. Nothing concrete, but enough to make investigators dig deeper. Digital footprints were the next step. Police accessed Emily's phone records, cloud backups, and laptop. What they found raised more questions than it answered. Her phone had last pinged the home's Wi-Fi at 20:46 a.m. on the morning she disappeared. After that, nothing. No outgoing calls, no texts, no app usage. It was as though she had ceased to exist. And yet one strange anomaly stood out. A week before she vanished, Emily had deleted a folder on her laptop. Forensic analysts recovered it. It contained screenshots of a private message exchange. The sender was anonymous, using the handle grayhello33. The messages were flirtatious, cryptic, and increasingly personal. The last message from Emily simply read, "I'm not sure about this." Police now had a new direction. Who was grayhello33? Was this a harmless online flirtation? Or something far more dangerous? The search for a missing woman had just turned into a hunt for a shadow. It was the 18th day since Emily Carter vanished, and the case that once seemed to have no direction suddenly shifted. A quiet neighbor, Denise Morrow, came forward with something she had been too nervous to share earlier. She lived across the street and slightly to the left of the Carters' house. She hadn't wanted to get involved, hadn't been sure what she saw mattered. But now, with the search dragging on and the town holding its breath, her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. Denise told detectives that on the night Emily disappeared, she had woken up to use the bathroom around 3:15 a.m. As she looked out her second-story window, she saw someone walking quickly down the side of the Carter property. The figure was covered in a hoodie, and they were carrying something. A large, awkward-looking bag. At the time, she assumed it was Brian, maybe taking the dog out or dealing with a trash bin. It wasn't unusual for him to be outside early. He was an early riser. But now, replaying it in her mind, something about the movement, the secrecy, the shape of the bag, it all felt wrong. Detectives obtained footage from Denise's home security camera. The image was grainy and dim, but it captured what she described as a figure in dark clothing, head down, emerging from the Carters' backyard and heading down the street. The timestamp was 3:18 a.m. A fresh wave of urgency swept over the investigation. This wasn't just a disappearance anymore. Someone had left the scene that night, and it wasn't Emily. Attention turned to the digital breadcrumb trail Emily had unknowingly left behind. Her private conversations with grayhello33s were unsettling. The messages hinted at emotional distance between her and Brian, and a growing curiosity, maybe even excitement, about someone else. It wasn't clear how much she had told this stranger about her life, but the messages had taken a darker turn just days before her disappearance. The last two messages from Greyhallow 33's read, "Don't be scared. I'm not like him." And then, "Are you ready?" Police tracked the username to a man named Darren Voss. He had once attended the same college as Emily, but they hadn't stayed in contact. Or so it seemed. Darren was single, worked in IT support, and lived about 30 miles from Ravenwood. When police interviewed him, Darren appeared calm, even helpful. He admitted to messaging Emily, but claimed they never met in person. He said it was harmless, a fantasy. But during a search of his apartment, investigators found dozens of photos, images of Emily walking her dog, grocery shopping, even through the windows of her home. He had been watching her for weeks, maybe months. Detectives immediately placed him under arrest for stalking, but something still didn't add up. Darren insisted he wasn't involved in Emily's disappearance. He claimed he had been outside her house the night she vanished, an admission that initially stunned investigators, but insisted he hadn't gone inside. He said he saw someone else. A second figure, larger, wearing a hoodie and gloves, entering through the side gate just before 3 a.m. Darren claimed he waited in his car for hours, watching until that figure returned with a large duffel bag slung over their shoulder. At first, the story seemed too convenient, too perfect. But when his GPS and phone data confirmed that he had indeed parked near the Carter residence that night, his story gained disturbing credibility. Darren may have been obsessed, possibly even delusional, but he might also have witnessed something real. Investigators were now chasing a different suspect, someone who had both motive and access, someone who had gone unnoticed in the chaos. And the key to unlocking everything might not lie in what Darren saw. It might lie in what he didn't understand. Because whoever had left the Carter home with that bag in the dead of night hadn't expected to be seen. But they had been. And now the walls were starting to close in. The investigation had finally pierced the surface. Darren Voss, the man behind Greyhallow 33's, was in custody, but his story cracked open a deeper, more disturbing layer. Investigators no longer believed Emily had walked out of her home on her own. She had been taken, deliberately. And if Darren's account was true, he had unknowingly witnessed her abduction, while stalking her himself. The hooded figure he described wasn't Darren. And it wasn't Emily. Surveillance footage from a distant street camera, grainy, low resolution, nearly useless, offered the first real lead. It showed a man walking beside a woman who closely resembled Emily at around 3:25 a.m. They moved quickly, heads down, a gym bag swinging between them. The woman's face was difficult to see, but her body type and gait seemed to match Emily's. The man was taller, wearing a gray hoodie pulled tight over his face. Using facial recognition, detectives matched the man's features to someone unexpected: Simon Ellery. He wasn't a stranger or a neighbor. He was Brian Carter's coworker, a systems analyst at the same tech firm. Simon had been let go 2 months earlier after a series of behavioral issues and erratic absences. No one had connected him to the Carters before now. His name hadn't come up in interviews. He hadn't been part of Emily's social circle. But when investigators obtained a warrant for Simon's phone and financial records, a much darker picture started to emerge. Hidden within encrypted messaging apps and deleted email drafts were conversations between Brian Carter and Simon, stretching back several weeks before Emily's disappearance. The tone was clinical, cold, and deeply disturbing. These weren't casual exchanges. They were plans. Meticulous, methodical steps that outlined how to make someone disappear without a trace. The messages suggested Brian had grown suspicious of Emily's online interactions. He believed she was cheating, emotionally, if not physically. Whether it was jealousy or a twisted need for control, Brian had decided on a solution. He would remove Emily from his life, not through divorce or confrontation, but through disappearance. The plan was simple in theory. Simon would stage a kidnapping. Emily would be taken quietly, without violence, and held somewhere no one would look. The ultimate goal was to keep her missing just long enough for Brian to declare her legally dead and collect a sizable life insurance payout. In exchange, Simon would receive a portion of the money. The messages revealed disturbing details: times of day, house entry points, backup plans, burner phones. It was a partnership rooted not in desperation, but in calculation. Investigators acted quickly. They tracked Simon's movements through his phone's location data. For weeks following Emily's disappearance, he had frequently visited a derelict property about 15 miles from Ravenwood. The house had been abandoned for years, foreclosed and forgotten. Neighbors thought it was empty, the perfect place to hide someone in plain sight. Detectives organized a raid. On the 27th day of Emily Carter's disappearance, they forced open the back door of the crumbling house. Inside, dust and silence coated every surface, until they reached the basement. Behind a false wall, they found a narrow room, no windows, one mattress, a bucket, a single light bulb dangling from a wire. And on that mattress, barely able to sit up, was Emily Carter. She was alive, fragile, and visibly shaken. Her wrists were bruised from restraints. Her voice cracked from dehydration. But she was conscious. When asked if she knew who had done this, she managed just 2 quiet words. Brian knew. The case had twisted itself into a horror story. The man who had tearfully pleaded for his wife's return on camera had orchestrated her disappearance. And now, with Emily safe in a hospital and the truth exposed, the depth of the betrayal and the darkness of the plan was finally coming into the light. News of Emily Carter's rescue spread through Ravenwood like wildfire. Neighbors who had once pitied Brian now looked at him with a mixture of shock and revulsion. For nearly 4 weeks, he had stood in front of flashing cameras, begging for answers, holding vigils, and shaking hands with search volunteers, all while knowing exactly where his wife was. He had stood in the middle of the storm he created, wearing the mask of a grieving husband. Emily, now recovering in a private wing of the hospital under police protection, began to piece together her story for detectives. She remembered almost everything. The night she disappeared, she had woken suddenly to find someone in the room, someone she didn't immediately recognize. Her first instinct had been to scream, but a cloth was pressed to her mouth before she could make a sound. She was drugged. The next time she opened her eyes, she was in the basement of an unfamiliar house, the windows boarded, the door locked from the outside. Simon Ellery had kept her alive, fed her just enough, spoken to her only in vague phrases about being set free, and starting over. He never mentioned Brian by name. He never admitted his role in what was happening. But Emily suspected from the beginning that this wasn't random. It was too clean, too coordinated. Her instincts were right. For weeks, Simon had visited the abandoned house every 2 days, staying for only brief moments. Sometimes he brought food. Other times he just stared at her, as if trying to figure out what to do next. Emily later told police she believed he was unraveling, that the plan was falling apart, and he didn't know how to finish what he started. After Simon and Brian were arrested, investigators unraveled the remaining layers of the conspiracy. Brian's motive was a combination of paranoia, greed, and resentment. He believed Emily was slipping away from him emotionally, and he couldn't handle it. Rather than confront her or leave the marriage, he chose to punish her in the most calculated way possible. The life insurance policy, worth $750,000, had been quietly increased just 2 months before her disappearance. He had even begun transferring small sums of money into hidden accounts, preparing for a future without her. Simon, on the other hand, was the willing accomplice. Bitter from his job loss and deeply unstable, he had developed a toxic loyalty to Brian. He saw the plan not just as a way to earn money, but as an opportunity to prove himself. He had built the false wall in the abandoned house, scouted the location, and handled every detail of the abduction. The plan might have succeeded had it not been for Darren Voss, the obsessive stalker who unknowingly witnessed the crime. The trial began 3 months later and captured national attention. Emily testified, her voice steady but haunted. Brian never looked at her from the defendant's chair. He pled not guilty, claiming Simon acted alone. But the evidence, the texts, the surveillance footage, the financial records, spoke louder than any denial. The jury returned its verdict in under 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Simon was sentenced to life without parole. Brian, who had masterminded the plot, received the same. Emily never returned to the Carter house. She sold the property, changed her name, and moved to a new city with her sister. She rarely spoke to the media, but in one written statement, she said something that stayed with the public long after the cameras turned off. You never expect your worst nightmare to come wearing the face you've loved the most. Her story was not just about survival. It was about betrayal, obsession, and the quiet evil that can live undetected behind closed doors. Emily Carter disappeared from her own home, and for 27 days, the world believed she was gone. But in the end, the truth didn't just return, it demanded to be heard.